Thank you, Deacon and Peter, for your willingness to be with us, even if from afar, when in days of global crisis and social distancing, you gave us all a sense of closeness and a shared quest. Also, many thanks for your multifaceted inspiration to us. Now let's us move to the first lecture. Dr. Deacon Bevington is a consultant in child and adolescent psychiatry, working in the NHS in Cambridgeshire. Hi, Deacon. He also works as a medical director of the Anna Freud Center, London, where he is a developer of mentalization-based treatments, in particular AMBIT, with Dr. Peter Frugel. Prior to medicine, Deacon studied anthropology and comparative religion, and he was a keen mountaineer, מטפס הרים. Some of those interests have found their way into AMBIT. Dr. Bevington has published a variety of books, including co-authorships of What Works for Whom, a critical review of treatments for children and adolescents, with Fonagy, Cottrell, Phillips, Glaser, and Allison, and the book, Adaptive Mentalization-Based Integrative Treatment, a guide for teams to develop systems of care, with Fonagy, Frugel, and Cracknell. Deacon also presents and teaches internationally. Dr. Bevington, your first lecture is about disintegration as a default in teamwork. So let us start with the question, what are the problems that call for the AMBIT for solutions like AMBIT?
Thank you, Na'ama. What a lovely introduction. How embarrassing. And now all I have to do is gently disappoint you. I'm going to share some slides in a moment, but I do want to say from my heart how extremely welcome both Peter and I have been made to feel by you and the wonderful group around you. And when Aurea was saying, the title, from disintegration to integration, I was thinking to myself, well, that's a tough challenge. It's in Israel, you know this as well as we do in the UK, and the theme underlying my talk is really that disintegration is often, or really is, the resting state of human beings, particularly human beings with different professions and different languages and different faiths, if you like. And so even if we don't manage to go from disintegration to integration, if we can go from disintegration to disintegration with more understanding and compassion, and without this taking us off our task, our shared task, which is to help the most vulnerable in our society, then, we don't need to be so disappointed, because maybe full integration feels kind of quite scary to many people. I think disintegration allows a certain amount of freedom, but it's where we allow disintegration to harm the most vulnerable amongst us that we might want to address. So let me share my slides now, and if that's okay, I will start to just sort of use them a little bit in the background, and we will try to give some time for questions. If I don't have enough time at the end of this talk, we've made enough time at the end of Peter's. He's got a slightly longer slot, so there may be time for one or two if I get on. So yeah, I really want to introduce you to the idea of AMBIT. Some of you may know a little or a lot about this, and some, I'm assuming, really not very much. So this is my hope. And really, AMBIT was developed for patients, clients, young people originally, although we work with adults now, for people who often do not experience help as helpful. And as a result, they often get labeled as hard to reach, which is a phrase we used to use and we now reject, because we think this is really rather judgmental of the people we're trying to be helpful for, as if it is their fault for being hard to reach, and not our fault for serving them something which is not helpful to them. So let me move on. I'm going to try to cover then this question really, as Na'ama said, you know, what is the problem that requires AMBIT? But before I get on to that, I want to just say a little bit about the context of where AMBIT came from. It's always helpful to understand someone or something, just to know a little of their history. Because I would like to be bold and say that I think this connection across the airwaves is maybe, could be a really important meeting of minds, I hope, but also of purpose. And we would like to feel that you could feel included in our journey. So I will talk a little bit then about the problems that we see, and hopefully that will make sense to you in the kind of work that we're doing, and that in schools, in hospitals, in clinics, in housing settings, many professionals would meet, which called for a solution like AMBIT. And then I have to get to the heart of my talk, which is to share with you, if you like, this word, mentalizing. Some of you will be very familiar with this word, others not. And some will be feel allergic to a word as scientific as mentalizing. But I hope to use this opportunity to show you this is at its heart a very simple idea. It is not, if this talk is too complicated and one feels I have to be some kind of super brain to do this, I have failed miserably. This is at its heart a simple idea based on complicated and detailed science. But what I want to show you is that these ideas change our practice as much as our kind of how clever we feel we are. So, and that's this word mentalizing. So I will spend a little bit more time just describing what mentalizing is. And then just at the end, I will kind of, if you like, present how AMBIT is slightly different from how mentalizing has been used to date, which is as a form of therapy. But teachers don't see themselves as performing therapy, and social workers don't see themselves as necessarily performing therapy, or youth workers, or police officers, or prison officers, and yet they do help. And I'm going to argue that the way that we help is probably connected to the way that we mentalize. And AMBIT offers some ideas about how we might use this idea to structure the work that we do with each other as professionals, across systems and across organizations. In the second talk, my friend and colleague Peter will go into a little bit more detail about what that looks like in practice, and go into some more detail. So that's my hope, and I better get on, otherwise I'm going to get behind. I mean, AMBIT goes back a long way to the last century, in fact, which makes it sound very old. Originally, it was called integrative multimodal practice, and here, surrounded by fossils, is the first ever version of the AMBIT manual. In those days, we used this old-fashioned material called paper. Some of you will remember it. And a bit later on, we started, Peter and I, to kind of develop these ideas, but we started to develop them online on what we call a wiki, for those who are interested. And that has continued to develop until this day. So what I want you to understand is that AMBIT has, from its very beginning, really, been what we would describe as an open source approach, an open system, and that it's all about continual learning, not about a group of clever, wonderful maestros deciding that they know exactly what everybody else needs. That we've tried to design AMBIT as this learning system as much as a thing in itself. What does that mean? Well, it means that we really started from the very beginning by training teams or people who did this very tricky kind of work. But then, if you like, learning from them about what we had tried to share, about how that might work and apply in their lives, in their working lives, and then taking the learning from them to kind of repair the things that were broken in our model that was up in the internet sky, our wiki. And then we would train another team with our slightly revised, improved, slightly less terrible model. And it is that iterative experience that means that integrative multimodal practice became briefly mentalization-based integrative outreach that everybody in the UK, that says MBio, and it sounded like a washing powder for your clothes, so that didn't last very long. Then we became adolescent mentalization-based integrative treatment. And more recently, when we published our book, we changed the name again to adaptive mentalization-based integrative treatment. Actually, we prefer the word AMBIT. AMBIT is an English word, actually not an English word, it comes from the Latin originally, closer to you. And your AMBIT is your sphere of influence, that part of my life where I can reliably hope to have an influence. And I am going to suggest that in our work, I will assume to know enough about yours, certainly in mine, that our AMBIT is not clear often. There are areas where I know I can have some influence, but there are many areas where I might, if I create a relationship with the person, but I may not have authority or power in the way that I, you know, in my fantasy world, I would be able to tell everybody what to do. In reality, this is not the case. So this is the story of AMBIT, that it is built piece by piece, repairing those bits that are wrong. And it's grown into something, I think, that now does speak to the condition that workers in this kind of world experience. And I think it's in as much as AMBIT tells a story that workers recognize, that it can be helpful. And it was really rather late in the day that Peter and I recognized that we had not invented an entirely new way of creating new treatments or interventions, that some very fantastic researchers in our field of child mental health, John Weiss and Helen Simpson-Gray, had already described this in principle, and they called this a deployment-focused development, which is rather different from how they maybe a little bit judgmentally described as the pharmaceutical model of development, where you go away to a laboratory, you create a method, and then you do a randomized trial to prove that your method is better than nothing or something. And once you've done that, it's become evidence-based practice, and then you sell trainings for the rest of your life and go away in an expensive car or something. I think we discovered that actually what they were describing, this deployment focus, this feedback-informed loop of endless improvement, seemed to us to be very close to what we had stumbled upon by putting our work in a wiki and making it open to the world from the very beginning. So that's a little bit of history. And I do want to repeat my invitation that we see this as a really, genuinely an exciting development for us. That what Na'ama and all of you have already done is developed some sort of locally led interpreting of what some of our ideas are. And you've already done a lot in terms of how you might start to implement some of these ideas in a complex organizational structure, and particularly around the field of education. I just want to sort of make it clear that, we would be very keen to foster some kind of collaborative endeavor. There are some other settings where AMBIT has been applied in explicitly educational settings. In the UK, there's one or two places, particularly one school, which is a special needs development that is run by a teacher who for many years ran the school in an adolescent psychiatric unit before that. There's a very interesting service in Denmark that we've worked with that works with young people who are in school refusers. They're not attending school. Actually, they've managed to be so successful with their school non-attenders that they're all now attending school. So the whole team has had to slightly change its approach, and they're trying to work more with the existing school. And quite a long time ago, but there was a team that worked with educational support workers who would outreach to schools around the city of Geneva. So in the spirit of AMBIT, I hope I can show you and share with you, and that Peter will, things that are helpful. But I'm not joking when I hope that we learn more from you than you do from us. And I present that as my challenge to you, but also in hope. So our original target was young people where there was this high level of risk, a kind of low engagement in conventional services, and also that there was some evidence about what happens, but a lack of evidence, because these were young people that had multiple difficulties. And we began working with outreach teams, a substance use service, my own team in and around the Cambridge area, teams working with young people who were right on the edge of being taken into formal care, family placements or breakdown, a service that Peter was working with at the time. And we then started to be invited to work with other teams. We did quite a lot of work with teams working with gangs, with youth violence, teams working with early psychosis. We worked with safeguarding services based in social care, which began to take us away from health so much. We worked with youth offending teams. We worked with more conventional outpatient services in mental health and inpatient services, including schools in these settings. And then we began to work with kind of much larger locality-wide trainings, where we were training people from health, social care, and to some extent education as well. And the point being to try to create common languages across these complicated systems. We've worked in children's homes. We worked with adults in prisons, in adult services for adults who get labeled with personality disorder. And the most recent, rather dramatic, we're just about to start training the service in a team that works with renal dialysis with young people with severe kidney disease, which is so far from what Peter and I know about. It's extraordinary, but they've spent quite a lot of time and have realized actually there's a lot of what we're talking about, that the nurses and doctors and social workers and therapists that work with this group felt that this is going to be potentially quite helpful for us. So you can see that the ambit of AMBIT has sort of expanded in ways that certainly was not our original plan, and we've trained teams all over the world. So it's a delight to be thinking about helping services in Israel to develop this. Let's kind of get into the kinds of problems. So I've already said the young people we originally focused on were people whose difficulties were described as complex or multiple, and all young people are on some kind of trajectory. We hope a trajectory that will help them by the time they reach maybe 18, 19 or 20 to have these really basic skills and capacities achieved. Some academic qualifications, literacy, numeracy, some social skills, the ability to fall in and out of love with some grace, to do a job interview, to sustain themselves in some way in life ahead. And of course, if you don't clear those trees at the end of the runway by the age of 18 or 19, your life chances are massively reduced. So this is a time critical exercise when we think with young people. And I'm sure it is probably the same in Israel, but it is somewhat culturally influenced this. But society at this time in our life, the last 100 meters of the runway for the airplane, society is starting to walk backwards. Society is saying, you're an adult now. You know, you need to take responsibility for yourself. Social workers start to talk about you're making bad choices rather than you have a safeguarding need. So just at this critical moment where the airplane is trying to set its trajectory, often a young person finds that services become less easy for them to access. And the young people that we're talking about may have a whole cloud of difficulties, ranging from early abuse, neglect, trauma, very frequently, some degree of educational, what gets judged as educational failure, that they're seen as, you know, not kind of great pupils for various different reasons. And they may become low in their mood, in their self-esteem. They may start to use drugs or alcohol. They're then at risk of all kinds of other problems. And each problem that you have makes helping the other problems more difficult. So in the end, what you end up with, often the final sort of crown that they're given is this diagnosis of personality disorder, but not always. But what we want you to understand is this: it's the multiple, intersecting, interacting, synergistic needs. It's that clumping that is what weighs down the aeroplane, not necessarily an individual item in that problem list. And in that situation, with those many different problems, we as professionals put our wings on and we fly towards these young people and the families that they live in. And one young person I worked with quite a few years ago, he once said, although he said it more rudely than I will say it to you because this is an international conference, but he said, "Doc, it's like being set upon by a flock of starlings," which are these birds that fly in big herds. It was a very powerful image. And what I think he was describing was that individually, these helpers, these professionals, may all have had good intentions, but his experience of them was incredibly aversive. It was absolutely the opposite of what any of us, the social workers, the teachers, the offending officers, the whoever else, we did not get up in the morning to overwhelm this young person, but that we did. And we talked about this in the developing model of AMBIT, and we talked about it as this notion of the Tower of Babel effect. My comparative religion comes in here. I like this. It's one of the few stories that appears both in the Torah and obviously the Bible, but also in the Quran. So it's a kind of truly kind of international and interfaith story, the story of human endeavor to build a tower to heaven, and God deciding, this is a terrible idea, I need to stop this immediately, and inventing language. And of course, what do we do as professionals in our specific trainings? We learn a professional language. And what do we ask of a young person and their family, perhaps, when we approach them, maybe me as a psychiatrist, Peter as a psychologist, another person as a family therapist, a teacher, a youth offending officer. We all bring our own language, our own explanations, our own interventions, and our own sense of who else should be doing what. And it's as though we ask of this family and this young person at the most vulnerable point in their life, that they do the work of integrating and not us, just when they're perhaps feeling at their most disintegrated themselves. So I think, you know, if you like, is if this image makes sense, that sometimes, not out of bad intentions, out of good intentions, we inadvertently create a very aversive experience for people who often their experience of helping relationships, of relationships with authority, with power, are often very poor. It makes very good sense for these people particularly to be less than trusting of people who talk differently from them, who look as though they come from a different background, who have power. That these people in the past, they may well have experienced as bringing humiliation, shame, blame, and all kinds of things. So it does make sense that they find us difficult. Yeats, famous Irish poet, this is going to really trouble our poor interpreter, but don't worry about it. It's a beautiful way of framing what I think we're talking about. Things fall apart. The center cannot hold. Near anarchy is loosed upon the world. And then this lovely phrase, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. And I'm sure that all of us can read those words and translate that into the political, the religious, the kind of craziness that is around us in our world. That when people become decentered or lost from the center, they either become filled with a passionate intensity that can be rather damaging, or a sense of lostness and confusion. And we're trying to find a place between the two. So one of the things that we talk about a lot is that instead of seeing disintegration, the pulling apart of things, the way that things don't fit, instead of seeing that as a mark of failure or of some kind of malign influence, some kind of laziness or ignorance or power politics that is caused by some other professional, if we see disintegration is actually the natural resting state of these very complicated networks where individual practitioners have maybe spent years and a lot of their own money training in learning a language, a framework of intervention, creating their own professional network and hierarchy in which they see themselves. It's extraordinary that actually we as a multi-professional, multi-agency networks, actually, we work together brilliantly a lot of the time, but that we constantly get upset when we do experience ourselves as delivering something less than perfect. So I suppose in a sense, you know, what AMBIT was very clearly trying to echo was this feeling that how do we find a way to articulate this difficulty, and more than that, a way to actually help work within this field where disintegration will always happen. We will never achieve pure integration, and maybe if we did, it would look like a kind of totalitarianism. So maybe there's something in disintegration that enables a certain freedom, but it can become so destructive. We know that. So we're trying to kind of create some kind of slightly better form of integrating our work. And that's where we come to really now what I'm going to describe as the meat or the central part of my talk, which is this idea of mentalizing. Now, ideally, practice, what you and I do in the field, face-to-face with young people, should rest on a solid foundation of theory that's evidenced and, you know, the science and things. I think in practice, it often looks like that the theory becomes the kind of the elevated idea. And those of us who do the work, we sort of feel that we're the people on the ground looking up. And there are lots of theories the neuroscientists are pretty strong, aren't they? If you show a photograph of a brain, immediately people go, ooh, science. But, you know, the psychoanalysts, they need a very big, long Zeppelin. There are systems theorists. There's cognitive behavioral theorists. There's social ecological models. And of course, there's a lot of learning theory. And those are just a few. I don't want to pretend that there are not other theoretical models. And I think one of the most distressing, upsetting, intolerable things that we do as professionals is when we get into a kind of battle of the models. But actually, you know, what attracted us, and it wasn't actually that we put it in the middle. Originally, mentalizing was just one of a whole range of tools that AMBIT was kind of sharing with people. And it was our feedback from teams that we were working with that kind of pulled mentalizing into the center. And it makes sense to us because if you talk to Peter Fonagy, Georgi Gergely Chibra, some of the theoretical and experimental scientists that developed this idea and initially turned it into the first form of therapy, a mentalization-based therapy, they would very clearly say that from the earliest outset, they were trying to create an integrative idea that spoke respectfully to neuroscience, to attachment studies, to psychoanalytic ideas, but equally to social cognitive theories and systemic theories. And insofar as mentalizing has become much more widely used as an idea in the last 20 or 30 years, I think they succeeded. So I want to try and just describe to you a little bit about what mentalizing is. One way of looking at it is a particular a way of trying to bring together what the brain and the mind a little bit, but more than that. But I think mentalizing speaks respectfully of what people who work in a cognitive behavioral way of thinking have worked out for many years. And it equally, it speaks respectfully, and I hope in a way that fits with what systemic therapists have thought about, those who work in sort of families and see causation as being more circular. But actually what a family therapist, a systemic therapist does is they found very beautiful, elegant ways to help family members or members of a system make sense of each other. And that's kind of, you know, they found effective ways of helping people mentalize, just as the analysts have. For the last 100 years, when an analyst places an interpretation, if it's well placed, it does something between the analyst and the patient. The patient goes, oh, that's fascinating. I've never thought of it that way. How did you, woo? And that's, they've enabled, stimulated the patient to begin to mentalize. And there are biological and social and ecological models that would say, you know, making sense of the impact of hunger on a young person is the same thing. So the team I work with, we work with young people who may have been on a sort of 3-day drug or alcohol binge. And they may come to a session with us. I mean, that would be amazing, but they may come and they may not have eaten for 2 days because they've just been taking drugs. Now, one way of approaching that is our workers think, well, my job is to do some drug and alcohol work. I'm going to do some motivational interviewing or some education about the risks of drugs. And that's what I'm paid to do. That's what I'm going to do. But a mentalizing approach would help them to think about the pain in this young person's stomach and think actually maybe to create a fit, we need to walk down the road to buy a little bread and some cheese or something to make a little food so that they're fed. And on the way back, walking back to the office, they may have the conversation that they wanted to have. So all of these are illustrations of mentalizing at work. Maybe these people would not use the language of mentalizing. So let me just try to define what I mean by this word. Yeah, actually, the first two words of the title of this slide are maybe a good definition of mentalizing. The activity of making sense. Yeah, it's a making sense thing. But we could be a bit more particular about that. It's an imaginative activity. It has a kind of wondering, playing with ideas, kind of playing around with thoughts rather than a sort of certainty. So it's an imaginative, but it is a brain activity. I can put people into a functional magnetic resonance imager, MRI scan. I can get them to perform a task looking at a bit of video of some people interacting. I can pause the video and ask them a question which stimulates them to mentalize. And when they do, we see a particular part of their brain, the prefrontal cortex, become active and busy. And we can do that reliably. So it's an imaginative state of mind based in the brain, but it is a state of mind, and many other states of mind exist. It would be a terrible, I'm going to argue, awful world, a terrifying world, if the only state of mind possible was mentalizing. We would all starve to death in very short order. But when I'm in that state of mind, when I'm mentalizing, I'm actively trying to make sense of human behavior. That's what mentalizing is, the trying to make sense. I might be trying to make sense of your human behavior, or I may be looking in a mirror and thinking to myself in the evening or the morning, why did I say that? What was going on? Why do I always get into these problems? What was going, and if I can get into that, that wondering, that sense of kind of figuring out is what I'm talking about. And how do I make sense of behavior, yours or mine? I do it by assuming that you are mental. And when I use the word mental like that, I mean that you have a mind, and that your mind contains beliefs, hopes, fears, intentions, and that it's by kind of imagining. I wonder if did you hit me because you believed that I had a gun and that I was going to shoot you? Because that's a much more understandable reason for you to hit me than if you hit me because you just thought I was an idiotic Englishman who was boring. Those are two completely understandable reasons to hit me, but I hope that you wouldn't hit me for either of them, because I'm doing my best. So what does it look like when this prefrontal cortex is busy, when I'm actually actively mentalizing? Well, I use an example from the animal kingdom. The dog is actually, according to some rather elegant experiments that I don't have much time to describe, any in fact, but it's probably the next best mentalizer, actually probably better than some of the higher primates even. And maybe it's this idea that dogs and humans have co-evolved over many, many centuries. But dogs are not very good at mentalizing, if I'm honest, compared to humans. Humans are the species, which is the thing that distinguishes Homo sapiens, wise Homo, from any other species in the earth. But dogs do a little bit of it. What does it look like when I'm mentalizing? Well, I have this kind of curious questioning, looking at the world from different perspectives, trying to get a different, just a slightly different idea about what was going on. So curiosity is a good clue that that's probably mentalizing. Notice that that is different from the idea of mind reading, when I know what you're thinking, I know how you feel. That's not mentalizing. That's the opposite of mentalizing. Mentalizing is this curiosity, this effort to try to kind of figure it out. I could be mentalizing, as I've said. I could be mentalizing about you, or I could be mentalizing myself. It's the same bit of brain that we have to do that, which is why our feelings get muddled up. The analysts call this transference and countertransference. Mentalizing is then this state of sort of not knowing. It's what another poet, Keats, he talked about negative capability, the ability to know that I do not know without needing to kind of collapse into certainty. And that he thought this was how the poets came to their creativity. And I suspect that it's this same not knowing stance that helps us when we to be experienced by another person as genuine, as authentic, as seeking relationship rather than domination. It's the seeking to understand. And it's hard work. It takes work to fire my prefrontal cortex. It's simpler to be certain. People who are mentalizing in the moment are aware that emotion in the room, if it's high or low, will change not only how good I am at making sense of you, but how good you are of making sense of me. So if we're yelling, it's unlikely that we're going to be so good at really making sense of each other. We've probably fallen into certainty. People who are actively mentalizing are able to hold a coherent story, a narrative of how I came to be here now with you and I in this context, behaving in the way that I am. Or if I'm mentalizing you, how come you're in this situation and behaving in this way? If I'm mentalizing, I can kind of tell the story. So mentalizing is not quite the same as mindfulness. Mindfulness is an awareness mostly of my own mind. You don't really talk of my mindfulness of your mind, but it's mostly an awareness of my mind here in the moment. It's not got such a strong sense of I've got a story of how I came to be yelling, that actually I didn't sleep very well. I had a small car crash on the way home. It was my fault. I felt really stupid and embarrassed. And when I got home, my dog didn't get up and welcome me, and I felt really rejected by everybody. And then you came and told me, that I'd forgotten to do the washing up. And then I started yelling at you. Now, that would be a coherent story of my unacceptable yelling behavior. And the final thing about mentalizing, a clue that I may be doing this mentalizing is almost entirely the root of human humor. Mostly a humor that enables me to make fun of myself. If I'm belittling you with humor, it's probably not a mentalizing humor. But humor mostly is, if you like, it's what Shakespeare described as the comedy of errors. That's what it is to be a human being. We're not very good at mentalizing each other. We've only just evolved this part of our brain. It only works under certain conditions, which is what I'm going to go on to say a little bit about. Before I say about how fragile mentalizing is, I just want to say something about, okay, so you grow this piece of your brain, the prefrontal cortex. Neanderthal man did not have very much prefrontal cortex. Dogs have got even less prefrontal cortex. Homo sapiens has got lots of prefrontal cortex. But how do we use it? Because people who are very good at mentalizing and people who are actually very poor at mentalizing, their brains, they look the same. So if you like, the prefrontal cortex is your hardware. The software is where it gets interesting. And we learn to mentalize by having the experience of being mentalized by somebody else, normally that we trust, mostly a parent or a carer, somebody who we feel safe with and is predictable in their behavior. It's the connection between secure attachment, for those of you who are interested in the science, and mentalizing. In a secure attachment relationship, it's much easier to mentalize. So that as the mother incubates the baby in her womb, after the birth, in her mind, it's the extent that she imagines the baby's mind, that the baby experiences themselves as starting to be an entity who has a mind. Minds incubate other minds. And here's a picture of a colleague of mine and her baby. And she gave me this after I'd given this talk a number of times and let me show it, where it's a classic example of what we would call mirroring behaviors. And many of you will have heard of that. So I want to kind of just make this point that mentalizing has a brain element, but primarily it's relational and social as a phenomenon. That it's the access to this mother's mind who can, if you like, shape her own face in a way that she's imagining herself into the shoes or the experience of her baby. And so it's not the Descartes' cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. It's my mother thinks I think, therefore I am. You discover your mind insofar as your mother imagines you to have a mind and shows you an image of that back on her face. And when a young person, and indeed as far as we know an adult, in fact we've got evidence to suggest that, experiences somebody else seeming to kind of understand them, it first of all calms them down. It helps me feel that if you seem to understand my state of fear or anger, I'm not the only one. I'm not kind of isolated and crazy for feeling this way, because I can see that you've kind of got it. You've got me. I can see. I kind of calm down. Then I can often start to mentalize again. So I want to really emphasize, because I think AMBIT, above any of the other mentalizing therapies, has really kind of held this idea that mentalizing is a function of social capital, of our connectedness to other human minds that we can trust. That when I'm not mentalizing, but my friend and dear colleague Peter mentalizes me, I calm down and I can do it again. So that kind of leads me into this kind of the last bit of my talk, which is really kind of how fragile mentalizing is. So this is really another slide saying the same thing that I've talked about before, that babies have this experience again and again of a parent imagining themselves into the baby's mind and showing the baby a benign version of that. So if the baby's cross, which neither of these babies are, the parent kind of doesn't just be cross back. That would be just mirroring. They do this thing called marked mirroring, where they go, oh, baby, oh, you are cross. Oh, dear. But so they have a frown on their face that shows a sort of, I get that you're a really angry baby or a really frightened baby, but there's things I do with my voice and eye contact and reciprocity that do what we call marking for the baby, that I'm not angry with you. I think you feel angry at the moment. Here's what angry faces look like. They look like that. And that's what we call marked mirroring. And this is, if you watch a baby with a mother or a father who's attuned, this is happening, what, every 5 minutes, every 10 minutes, every hour, every day, every week, for months and years. And to some extent, it never stops. And I'd like people to remember that when we talk about the use of mentalizing in our teams. So what I want to really kind of make clear then is this idea that most of us are born with brains that can do this quite easily. If you're born on the autistic spectrum, it's much harder. And for children with autism, it's often as important to work with the adults around them to help them do this thing that is very hard, which is to mentalize somebody who has autism. It's very hard to imagine yourself into the mind of somebody with the autistic spectrum. So helping the mentalizing around that young person. You may struggle to teach somebody with autism to mentalize accurately. And there's rather limited evidence other than in the most simple ways. But here's the mother and her, she's now pregnant, but she's got a little toddler. The toddler's distressed or upset. It's the extent to which she can imagine the mind of her little child. And that her child sees her, that her child starts to experience themselves as having agency and having a mind that could be happy or sad. But this mother can only do that or at least is massively helped to do that if she has perhaps a partner who can think about her. How difficult this must be with her being alone all day in a rather small flat. And perhaps, you know, she has a professional who can help her, who can imagine and understand maybe her existing mental health difficulties that make this job of making sense of her baby really overwhelming at times, and who can really help her to feel understood. And perhaps she's got a friend who is, you know, maybe the most important person, who she feels, you really get me, you really understand, you've known me all my life, whatever. So our ability to do this is connected to how many other people we have available who can do this for us. And I'd like you to hold on to that thought. So just to kind of really begin to round up my talk on what mentalizing is, I've referred it to already, but it's helpful to think that this prefrontal cortex is rather fragile. It's really very fragile. And mentalizing is designed that way. It's designed to switch off under conditions of stress and arousal. Now, how and why would that be? If I become stressed and aroused when this tiger is coming in, it makes sense. Stress and arousal is what's going to make me run away and know in the blink of one eye that this animal is dangerous, probably intends to hurt me or eat me. It's not any use to my survival to employ that rather slow, reflective, deliberative style of thinking, mentalizing. To mentalize this tiger is of zero use to me, I'm going to suggest. I don't have time for that kind of thought. I need certainty and I need action. And our brains are designed that when we get aroused, they switch into these much more primitive ways of thinking. I become absolutely clear that my thought about the tiger is not just a thought about the tiger, it is the tiger. And that's why we call this psychic equivalence, that my ideas about the tiger are the tiger. The tiger is bad, does intend to eat me. Now, there's a small chance that a tiger might actually be a pet tiger who thinks that I'm perhaps its master and is going to come and be very friendly. But I'm not going to base my interactions on tigers on that small chance. Adolescents tend to get much more into that kind of thinking. And the other thing I do when I see a tiger is I might slip into certainty, but very quickly I slip into action. So I resolve my anxiety by running away very quickly, or throwing something at the tiger, or some kind of physical action. And I think it's worth us remembering, you know, actually this happens to us in our professional lives frequently. When we get aroused, we start treating other professionals, teammates, or indeed our clients, patients, pupils with higher levels of certainty than we would if we were calm. And the other way that we lose our mentalizing is we slip into what we call the pretend mode, which is it's always a good time for me to start to wind up my talk, because it's too many words. They're very clever words, they may be very true words, but they don't connect me to you. The words get in the way. Very lovely, beautiful. Look at the way they're woven together. It's just there's no me and you anymore. I'm just lost in the cleverness and the kind of the interestingness of my ideas. And we see that in our professional lives. I'm going to claim that mental health professionals are the best at getting into pretend mode, but I suspect that social workers and teachers can too. We can all fall into certainty, we can all fall into action, and we can all fall into pretend mode. Now, those three forms of non-mentalizing are not just randomly kind of invented. They come from an understanding of brain function and development, and they are the building blocks of actually mentalizing. We need a bit of certainty sometimes. I need to be clear that any form of sexual contact between any member of my team and their clients is wrong. I don't want to be not certain about that. I don't want to be wondering about that. So certainty is helpful for safety. Action, likewise, is helpful for kind of, you know, basic safety things. And pretend mode is where often our new ideas, our kind of new perspectives come from, a kind of let's make believe and then we'll find out. So it's not that these are unhelpful, but they're very unhelpful if they're used where actually what we could do with is some mentalizing, and we lose our mentalizing under stress. So the key thing is that happens for the patient, for patients or clients, but equally for us, for the workers. And that's kind of where AMBIT has really wanted to help people kind of think about our interprofessional and our professional practice, which is to think about the vulnerability of our own mentalizing. So we kind of put mentalizing right at the middle of our wheel. It's like the axle that carries all the weight. It's commonly the case that we spread mentalizing only upwards. You know, therapies are really good at helping find ways to help our clients, our patients to mentalize. But AMBIT says there's 3 other directions that if you are not sustaining some mentalizing, the work is less likely to be sustainable and to be genuinely accepted and helpful. And those are to be mentalizing with our team members, to be mentalizing with the networks around us and learning. And, you know, so that's kind of, if you like, I'm going to sort of, to some extent, leave Peter to talk a little bit more, but just, if you like, to give you it in a nutshell, in terms of working with our client, we would see our work as constantly a sort of tug of war between trying to scaffold and strengthen existing relationships in a young person's life where there is perhaps some trust, some help, but recognizing that sometimes those relationships are also risky. Yeah, the young person may be in a family home where there's a high level of risk as well as, you know, some support. So we're kind of always trying to kind of balance between the rather more intervening element of managing risk. We don't want to take chances with safety, but at the same time, to be able to, if you like, work with the real world that this young person and family are in as much as we can. So acknowledging that there are some risks. And likewise, how do I keep going in that work, which, you know, endlessly throws me into these kind of feelings of kind of, oh, should I be doing more risk management, or can I work with this? Can I work with this relationship that they are telling me with themselves, that they hate themselves, they feel like killing themselves, but I don't think they're going to kill themselves, and I don't want to immediately admit them to hospital this moment because they may never talk to me. So how do I work with that? I need a team. And I need a team that does what? That mentalizes me. So as much as I create an individual relationship with a young person where they can experience me as mentalizing them, I need also to be thinking about who's holding my rope behind me. Has Peter kind of got me in his mind enough that I can keep mentalizing? And we might create a great team. Peter and I and our team in the AMBIT, we're a marvelous team. It's very tempting for our team to be very marvelous by measuring ourselves against how terrible some of the other teams are out there in the world. And this is destructive. It's like becoming 2 parents who, if you like, undermine each other in front of the child. And trying to create a team that works both with the multiple domains, which means there are lots of different professionals, but does my bit, to use that word, within my ambit, to increase the integration, to increase understanding across these multi-agency systems that systematically mentalizes. That's kind of, again, this kind of balancing act. More workers can be great, but it can also be part of the problem. And as many workers as there are, I need to do my bit within the power that I have to pull things, coordinate things around an understanding of what young person and the family find helpful. And then finally, just mentalizing as a team that can reflect on our shared learning. And then there's another tension between evidence from outside trials or our own outcome measures and kind of local expertise. And that's why Peter and I would never presume to know quite how AMBIT might work for you in an Israeli setting, in an educational setting that we're not experts on, but we can help you think about how you might want to adapt some of these ideas and the tools that Peter and I will talk a little bit about in our talks tomorrow morning. That might be where you start to do your adaptations, because we think that it's the ability for a team to adapt between what's evidence-based and what's their own experience, to bring those together is key to outcomes that are effective. So that's my my talk as just a beginning introduction. I hope that's been understandable. I apologize to the interpreter who's had to deal with my too many words going on. For those of you who are interested to look more, if you go to manuals.annafreud.org, from there you can access this online wiki where we write about everything that we've done in AMBIT. There's lots of materials, video and downloadable material. And Na'ama was very kind to introduce our book. And actually there's a second, not a second edition, a new book we hope is coming out probably at the end of this year, if I get on with the tasks that Peter has set me, because Peter's been far more involved in steering that one through. So thank you very much for listening. I'm going to stop sharing my slide now. Thank you.
Yeah.